Hello everyone, I am Ashutosh Mehra, and today I'll be talking about some of the features in Eclipse OpenGenine that help it in adapting to the cloud environment. So before we start, a brief intro about myself. I've been working with IBM in runtimes technologies for past 11 years, and I have previously worked on IBM J9 virtual machines and contributed to various components like shared class cache, port library, and cloud optimizations. And right now, I'm contributing to Eclipse OpenJ9 project and working in the JIT team. So let's begin with the list of topics that I'll be talking through today. So we'll first look at the at some of the challenges that the cloud environment presents for the runtime systems, and then we'll look at how OpenJ9 is handling these challenges, like adapting to the constrained environment uh, or the or the tuning it performs in the idle mode, and some of the effort that we are looking at that we are spending for to improve the startup time of the OpenJ9. So let's begin with the first topic, which is about challenges in the cloud environment. So this it is no brainer that cloud is quickly expanding its reach. Right, more and more workloads are getting deployed on cloud environment these days, and newer applications are also written with cloud as the target. And most of and the major players like all the big four companies, IBM, Amazon, and they are all heavily invested in this cloud ecosystem in terms of public, private, and hybrid cloud offerings. So cloud, there's no doubt that cloud is becoming the driving force of the industry these days, and because of this, it becomes important as a for a runtime system to understand the challenges that the cloud presents. So one of the characteristics of the cloud environment has been that it allows the user uh, to run their applications or workloads in a constrained environment. What that means is the user can impose resource restrictions in terms of memory and CPU, and the applications running in that environment they have to honor those limitations. Another selling point of public cloud has been the pay-per-use model, which means that the user has to pay only for the resources that the application is consuming. Again, this presents a challenge to the runtime systems because now we have to be very frugal in the resource usage. We have to actively look for opportunities wherein we can release the resources when they are not required, so as to keep the runtime cost of the system as low as possible. So, and lastly, the emergence of new architectures like serverless and microservices, they have the need to start the applications as quickly as possible. And again, this is a challenge for especially for systems, runtime systems like the JVM virtual machines. Moving on, let's look at how OpenG9 and how OpenG9 handles these challenges and what it has to offer. The first one is adapting to the constrained environment. So in traditional data centers, the applications were deployed using virtual machines. But now we but now we see that in the cloud environment, the containers are being used as a deployment mechanisms. The containers can be considered as lightweight virtual machines. They are very quick to start up and much easier to spawn, and they also provide a degree of isolation to applications, at least at the user space, although they share the same kernel. But the main characteristic of the containers that is relevant for runtime systems is their ability to put resource constraints on the processes. In contrast to the virtual machines, containers allow much finer level of control at the process level to limit the resource usage. For example, they allow the user to specify how much memory and how much CPU the processes can consume. And if the process does not honor these resource constraints, then they have to suffer consequences. They may get killed, or or they may suffer from the performance problems. So why are these things important for a JVM like OpenJ9? This is because the JVM needs to understand how much resources are available at its disposal, so that it can tune itself. For example, it uses the amount of CPU available to spawn the number of GC threads, and it uses the amount of memory available to figure out how much it can use during compilation or to set its default heap size. And in traditional non-container systems, JVM can get information about these resources by using OS-specific methods like system calls, sysconf, and schetgetAffinity or procfile system. But when we talk about containers, they use a Linux feature called cgroups to impose these resource constraints on the memory and CPU. And the problem is the OS provided mechanisms are not aware of the C group mechanism. So what happens is if you put a JVM inside the container, the proc file system or the system calls will not be able to provide the JVM with the resource constraints that are imposed by the container, and that results in JVM overestimating the resources available to it. And if it tries to go beyond the limits imposed by the container, then as I mentioned earlier, it can get killed. Or for example, if it goes beyond the memory limit of the container, then the Linux OM killer comes into picture and it may terminate the JVM process. Or if it tries to use more CPU resources, then it can get halted. So what can we do to make JVM aware of these container limits? One straightforward approach is that we update the system calls and the proc file system and make them aware of the container imposed limits. But this has, for some reason in the Linux world, this has not happened. So the only option we are left with is making the JVM aware of these limits by making it aware of the C group feature. So at this point, I will take a couple of slides uh, to uh, to brief you about the C group mechanism that will also help us to understand how OpenJ9 gets these limits. So as I mentioned, C group is a Linux kernel feature that allows the user to group a set of processes together for some specific purpose. It could be for monitoring the resource usage or to limit the resource usage. And Linux kernel exposes this mechanism through a pseudo file system called cgroup file system at the user level. The cgroup file system is mounted at sysfs cgroup. It's generally mounted at this location, but that's not a hard and fast rule. If you go to that location, you will see a number of directories, and all these directories correspond to a subsystem. Subsystem is an entity in the Linux kernel which is responsible for handling the particular resource. And each subsystem has a number of attributes which provide you accounting information for that resource or provide you with the ability to limit the usage of that particular resource. For example, there is a memory subsystem which handles all the memory related stuff. There is a CPU set subsystem which allows you to specify the set of CPUs that process can run on or the memory nodes that a process can use. Uh, then there is a CPU subsystem, CPU accounting subsystem that provide you information about CPU usage. And yeah, there are like dozens of subsystems in the C group that provide you information about the different resources. Within each subsystem, you can create multiple levels of subdirectories, and each subdirectory corresponds to a C group inside the subsystem. So when you start up the system, each subsystem in the C group infrastructure, it contains only it contains only one C group, which is the root C group, and all the processes belong to that root C group. So on this slide, you're on this slide, I put up all the control files present in the memory subsystem. All these control files are present in every C group which is created under a subsystem. And these control files provide you information. For example, if we are talking about the memory subsystem, then these control files provide you information about different aspects of memory usage. It could be kernel memory, it could be your physical memory, that's RAM memory, or the swap usage. And they also have control files to limit the usage of the memory of the process belonging to this C group. And when you create a new C group by creating a directory, all these control files get replicated in that particular C group. But the values of the values that are, or the information that these control files expose will be, that will be in context of the processes that belong to that C group. So, as I mentioned earlier, the C group infrastructure has dozens of subsystems, but the information that JVM needs is only about the memory and the CPU limits, and that information can be obtained by looking at three subsystems. These are the memory, CPU set, and the CPU. And the files which are relevant for getting this information are memory.limit in bytes, which is present in the memory subsystem and gives you the upper limit on the memory usage of the processes belonging to that C group. Then there is a CPU set.cpus file in CPU set subsystem, and it tells you the set of CPUs on which the process can run. And there is a quota and a period file in the CPU subsystem, which tells you how much amount of CPU you can use in a given period of time. So these files are sufficient for the JVM to figure out the memory and CPU limits that are imposed by the container or the C group. Before it can read the information from these files, JVM also needs to identify which C group it belongs to, and that it obtains that information by parsing the C group file in the proc file system under its PID directory. So on this slide, I have shown an example of the C group file of one particular process, and as you can see, it has the list of all the subsystems along with the C group that the particular process belongs to within that subsystem. So as an example, it shows you that this particular process belongs to the root C group in the CPU set subsystem. And when you look at the memory subsystem, it is part of the C group called sample. So this example also illustrates that the process can be part of different C groups in different subsystems. So we can now put all these things together and figure out how OpenJ9 gets the memory limits. The first step in that process is to verify that the C group file system is available or not. OpenJ9 gets this information by using a system called statfs, which tells you the type of the file system mounted at a particular location. And once it has verified that the C group file system is available, the next step is to identify the C groups to which it is part of for various subsystems that we are interested in, which are memory, CPU set, and the CPU. And once you have obtained the C group name for each of these subsystems, then it can it can create the path of these control files and read the information about the memory and CPU limits from these control files. So far we have been looking at C groups on the host system directly, but things are slightly different when it comes to containers. This is because when you start a container, the container runtime creates a new C group on the host file system, and this C group directory is what gets mounted as the root C group inside the container. So what that means is uh, the view of the C group file system inside the container is different than the host. Essentially, when you are running inside the container and when you are looking at the file system, C group file system inside the container, then you will see that all the processes uh, inside the container belong to the root C group. And because of this difference, what it means is OpenJ9 can actually skip parsing the C group file to get the C group name. It can just assume that it is part of the root C group when running inside the Docker container, and therefore get the control file. It can read the control files from the root C group of the C group file system to get all the memory and CPU limits that the container has imposed. So this is the slight difference between the scenario when when the OpenJ9 is running inside the container versus when it is running directly on the host. Now we look at some of the tunings and some of the improvements that we have made in OpenJ9 when running in a container environment. So the the first option is called use container support, and it controls whether OpenJ9 should use the container limits or not. It's enabled by default from Java 8 onwards, and it is strongly recommended not to turn it off. Otherwise, your process may try to use more memory or CPU than the limits imposed by the container and may run into problems. Then the next is a couple of options that we have added related to the heap sizing. These are the initial RAM percentage and max RAM percentage. These options are similar in their behavior. They are similar in their behavior as the XMS and XMX options, which have been used so far to set the initial and the max heap size. The difference between these set of options is XMS and XMX allow you to set the heap size using absolute values, while the percentage based options allow you to set your heap as a percentage of the total memory available to the JVM. And these options are particularly useful in container environments where your application can get deployed in containers with different memory limits. So if you are using the percentage based options, then you don't have to change the your options to set your heap size as the container memory limit changes. But if you are using the XMX or XMS to set your heap size, then as the container limit changes, you will have to adjust your heap as you will have to adjust your options settings to increase or decrease your heap size. So another change we have made in OpenG9 is to increase the default heap size when it is running inside the container. And to understand why we made this change, we need to compare the way memory is utilized in container environment versus the non-container. In non-container systems, uh, we have multiple processes running simultaneously, and they are sharing the system memory. And moreover, the operating system does not provide any way to limit the memory usage of a process. Therefore, any process can utilize as much amount of memory it needs, and can theoretically cause shortage of memory for other processes. Now, this also poses a challenge for JVM as it needs to allocate Java heap, which should be large enough to uh, to meet the application memory requirements, but at the same time, it should not cause shortage of memory for other processes by hogging onto it. And in that spirit, OpenJ9 sets the maximum heap size to 25% of the available memory with an upper limit of 25 GB, so that there's sufficient memory left for other processes as well. But when you are running in a container environment, they already provide an upper limit on the memory usage of an application. And therefore, if your all your processes are running in containers which have a memory which have a memory limit, then the contention for memory resource reduces a lot. And OpenJ9 identifies this and takes the advantage of this situation by increasing its heap size when it is running in the container. So you can see in this table, the table on this slide shows you the relationship between the heap size that OpenJ9 uses and the container memory limit. And it is pretty evident that the ratio of the heap size to container limit is much more than the ratio it is on the when we are running in a non-container systems. So especially when you're if you specify your container limit more than 2 GB, then OpenJ9 uses almost more than it uses 75% of that memory for its heap purpose. So this also improves the memory utilization and improves the density of applications in your system. So when you are running OpenJ9 and you encounter a problem, then it's normal to understand to understand the characteristics of the environment where the problem happened. And Java core is one such debug log that OpenJ9 uses, that captures the state of the environment where the process was running in. And since more and more applications are getting deployed in containers, it is natural that we add the information about the container environment in the Java code. So on this slide, I've shown you the snippet from the Java code that shows the C group information that we store in the Java core. So this information tells you whether the JVM is running in a container or not, and whether the JVM is aware of the container limits or not. And other than that, we also dump some of the metrics from the C group file system directly, like the quota and the period, amount of time the process has been throttled by the kernel, then the set of CPUs that it can run on, and various and various memory limit and swap limit, and the current memory usage and swap usage of the process. So this information is becomes really useful to understand the constraints that the JVM was running in if any problem happens. So now we move on to the next topic that deals with idle mode optimizations in OpenJ9. So it is very common for applications to have varying load patterns. There are instances where in the life cycle of the application where it will be heavily loaded, and it will be churning lot of objects, and there will be instances where the load will be very low, or there will be no load and the application would just be sitting idle. And the cloud infrastructures these days, like the JElastic Cloud, they have the ability to take advantage of these varying load patterns to vertically scale the applications up and down, to improve the utilization of the resources. So, but for these cloud platforms to be able to vertically scale the applications, they also need support from the underlying runtimes which are actually running the applications. uh, because if the underlying runtime has to identify the change in the state of the load, it has to know when the application has gone from active to idle state, so that it can release the resources. And this has been a problem with the JVMs. They can they can grow their heap when the load increases up to the maximum heap limit, but they don't have the ability to detect when the application load has come down. And as a result, they don't know when to release their resources back to the operating system, and this prevents the vertical scale down by a cloud platform. So in OpenJ9, we have identified this opportunity, and we have added a mechanism for using which the OpenJ9 can detect when the application load has changed from the active to idle state. And we will look at the mechanism in the next slide. Once the OpenJ9 identifies that it has gone into idle state, it performs a garbage collection and compaction, so that it can get a contiguous block of free memory, which it can release back to the operating system. And this allows us to scale down or reduce our memory usage in the idle mode. When we perform GC during idle phase, this also prepares this has another advantage, that it prepares the Java heap for the upcoming active period. And since since we have already done the GC and collected all the garbage during the idle phase, when the application goes back into active state, uh, it it will not it will not the chances of it running into GC are very less. This mechanism also improves the performance of the application in the active state to some extent. So on this slide, I've tried to capture the mechanism that we use for determining the idle state in OpenJ9. Basically, the mechanism piggybacks on the sampler threads JIT sampler threads state detection logic. JIT sampler thread is a native thread in OpenJ9 that wakes up at regular intervals to perform some housekeeping activity, like collecting. For example, it collects the CPU usage, or it it performs JIT state detection and class loading phase detection. And to regulate its own CPU usage, it it has a notion of state, which so it can transition from active state to the idle state and to deep idle, and in each of these state, it changes its frequency so that its CPU consumption remains low. And the trigger for the parameter that it uses for transitioning through these states depends on the number of active threads in the JVM, which is also a measure of the load on the application. So once the sampler thread reaches the deep idle state, and if it stays in that idle state for a specific duration of time, then it sends a notification to the virtual machine, upon which the virtual machine changes its state from the active to idle, and then it performs the GC cycle and the compaction, and the other activity that we discussed in the previous slide. So this is how the virtual machine is able to detect the OpenJ9 is able to detect the transition from the active to idle state based on the sampler threads state detection logic. This slide talks about some of the options that we have added for tuning the idle mode. The first of them is idle tuning GC on idle, which controls whether the GC should take place when OpenJ9 goes into idle state or not. And this option is disabled by default in the non-container environment, but we enable it in the container environment. The next option is ideal tuning min idle wait time. Uh, this specifies the minimum amount of time that JVM should remain in the inactive state before it transitions its state to the idle state. So the default is 180 seconds, but as we saw earlier that uh, the 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 mechanism that JVM uses for transitioning to active state depends on the sampler thread's state detection logic. Therefore, the actual time that the JVM waits is directly dependent on the sampler thread's frequency and the wait time of the sampler thread in each of its state. So even though the default value is 180 seconds, uh, it generally takes around if you consider the sampler threads transition states from active state to deep idle, that adds up another 120 another 100 seconds to the not 100 seconds. I think it adds up another 50 or 60 seconds. So it takes around almost 4 minutes for the VM to transition to the idle state by default. But you can set this value, you can reduce this value to make that behavior more aggressive. And then the last option is idle tuning min preheap on idle, which determines the minimum amount of preheap that the JVM should maintain after it has performed the idle tuning. So it's like an upper bound on the percentage of pre-memory pages in the object that can be disclaimed. And all of these options are available from Java 8 onwards. So now we move on to the last topic, which is about some of the effort that we have spent in looking at ways we can improve the startup time of OpenJ9 and make it really quick. As such, the OpenJ9 has various options. We'll look at them briefly to improve the startup time, but still we fall short of expectations of in some of the architectures, newer architectures. So, so it is a known fact that JVMs take quite a bit of time to start up, and the main reason for this is the JVM has to do a lot of groundwork before it can actually start executing the application code. So it has to do class loading, which involves disk access, and it has to parse the class files, create internal structures, perform bytecode verification. All these activities take quite a bit of time and slow down the startup process. Another factor that contributes to the slow startup is interpretation of bytecodes. Interpreting the bytecodes is considerably slow compared to executing the native code. And to offset that, the JVM uses something called just-in-time compiler, which performs compilation of the Java methods at the runtime. However, this on-the-fly compilation is a CPU-intensive activity, and therefore, depending on how many methods we are compiling and the aggressiveness of compilation, it can also impact the startup time of the JVM. So OpenJ9 has over the past years, it has added many options and features that attack different aspects of the startup problems that I just mentioned earlier. For example, OpenJ9 provides something called shared class cache, which reduces the need for disk access to get the class files. It also has the ability to perform dynamic AOT, ahead of time compilation, and it can store the AOT compiled code in the shared class cache, which can then be used by subsequent invocations to reduce the need for JIT compilations during the startup phase. And then there are a couple of options like Xtune Virtualize and Quick Start, which when specified, cause JVM to aggressively perform AOT compilations, and they also cause JIT to reduce its CPU usage, thereby bringing down the startup time. So in spite of all these improvements, The startup time of the JVM is still of the order of few hundred milliseconds. And if you talk about frameworks like OpenLiberty, they can take uh, close to a second to start up. And this is still considered slow compared to the compiled languages. And moreover, it has become apparent with the emergence of these microservices and serverless functions that the instant startup is very much needed, especially in serverless architectures, because they need the ability to scale down to zero, and then start up as many instances as required. And in such scenario, if your application takes considerable amount of time to start up, then the response time of your application is going to suffer. So it is not just the JVM that it's not just the OpenJ9 that suffers from this problem. This startup issue is something that every JVM has to deal with, and there have been efforts to improve the startup time. We will look at a couple of approaches that have gained some traction in the community to handle this challenge. So first of them is the pure AOT compilation. So the idea behind this approach is it's very similar to the compiled languages, where you compile a code written in high level language directly to the native code before you actually start execution of the application. In the context of JVM, this is called AOT compilation, or ahead of time compilation, to contrast it with the just-in-time compilations, because AOT compilations are happening before the execution of your application, while the JIT compilation happens during the execution. So to be able to perform pure AOT, uh, we need to identify all the code paths of the application. We need to know every method that can get executed at runtime, irrespective of whether it comes from the application code or from any of its dependencies. And GraalVM native image is an implementation of such an approach. It uses pure AOT compilation to improve the startup time. It takes input as your Java application code, and it performs static analysis on your application classes and all its dependencies to identify all the reachable code, and then it compiles them ahead of time, and it adds the memory management and thread scheduling and other runtime components required to create a native executable. And this native executable is self-sufficient. You can use this executable to start your application, and the startup time in when you are using GraalVM native image is of the order of a few milliseconds. At the max, it takes a few tens of milliseconds to start up. So which is a big improvement over JVM execution time. So another approach that we can use to improve the startup time is based on snapshots. Snapshots have traditionally been used in virtual machines and in operating systems to create restore points, so that if a failure happens, then we can go back to a working state. But here we are talking about the snapshot in the context of processes. And when I say snapshot of a process, what it means is to capture the runtime state of the process and store that runtime state in some persistent storage. For example, we can store it in on the disk in files. And how we can use this snapshot mechanism to improve the startup, that's pretty straightforward. You start an instance of the application and let that instance complete its startup activity. Once it has finished all the startup work, at that point in time, you take a snapshot. Uh, so that will capture the runtime state of that process, and from there onwards, if you want to start a new instance, all you have to do is restore the process from that snapshot that you have taken, and the new process that comes up will continue its execution from the point where the snapshot was taken. So what it means is all the new processes that are restored from the snapshot, they don't have to do any of the startup work, and only the first instance which we started to create the snapshot has to undergo the activities involved in the startup phase. So the new instances are up and ready to execute your application load once the restore process is over. And this approach has also proved to be very promising. I will show you the numbers comparing these two approaches in next couple of slides. The problem with this snapshot-based approach is currently no JVM provides this ability to create snapshots. And we have there's a tool, Linux tool called CRIU. We have been playing with this tool to in context of OpenJ9 to create snapshots and to get an idea of how much improvement uh, we can get using the snapshot mechanism. So the CRIU tool is an application agnostic tool. It can be used to take a snapshot for any snapshot of any runtime process. And the another advantage of CRIU is that it is integrated with the Docker container. So uh, what that means is you can take a snapshot of the whole container and restore the container at later point in time. So in this slide, I've tried to do a comparison of the two approaches that I just discussed and look at how they fare with respect to the normal execution or normal JVM execution in different categories. So obviously the startup, obviously these two approaches have they have a highly improved startup performance compared to the normal JVM. But if you pick up Graal native image case, it suffers from the peak performance drop. This is because the Graal native image uses ahead of time compilation to improve its startup, and it is a known fact that AOT compiled bodies they are inferior in the quality compared to a JIT compiled code. This is because they don't have the profiling information that the JIT compiler can access at the runtime. Because of this, the if you are using the native image to run long running applications, then they suffer from the peak performance, and it can be as low as 50% of what you get when you use normal JVM. Another factor where Graal VM native image has problem is with respect to support for Java features. So as I mentioned, it performs static analysis to figure out all the code paths, but there are certain features that Java language provides, for example, reflection and JNI and dynamic class loading, which make it difficult for static analysis to get to determine all the code paths. And in such cases, the GraalVM native image needs support from the user in terms of configuration files to let it know the exact classes and the methods that can get executed when these features are used. And another disadvantage is the GraalVM native image does not support runtime instrumentation. It does not have support for JVM TI or Java agents, which are used by many Java applications for bytecode instrumentation or to inspect the state of the VM at runtime. The snapshot-based approach suffers from high disk footprint. This is because when you take a snapshot, the what we are essentially doing is capturing the process address space and writing it into the disk. So obviously this results in extra disk usage, and if your process memory footprint is large, then the disk footprint of the snapshot will also going to increase. So these these are some of the advantages and disadvantages of these two approaches when we compare it with the JVM execution. In addition, we have also done some comparison between these two approaches to understand how much startup improvement we get compared to the normal JVM environment. And for this comparison, we used a demo application based on Quarkus framework. Quarkus is a framework that supports execution of Java applications in both JVM mode and using GraalVM native image. So for this study, we used four configurations. The first one was Quarkus JVM, wherein we ran the Java application in JVM mode using jar files, and we used OpenJ9 as the JVM. Then the second was Quarkus native, wherein uh, the application was created using GraalVM native image, which generated a native executable. Then the third was CRIU Xstart. Here the application was started by restoring it from a checkpoint, and the checkpoint was taken after the application has completed its startup activity. And last was the CRIU first response, which is again the same. We are starting the process by restoring it from a checkpoint, but in this case, the checkpoint was taken when the process has completed the uh, when the process has completed responding to the first request. So the table on this slide shows you the comparison of the numbers in each of these configurations, and it is easy to see the Quarkus JVM based approach uh, it is lagging. It's way behind the other three configurations. It is almost taking more than 500 milliseconds to start up, and compared to JVM, the other three configurations, they are able to start the application in under 100 milliseconds. So these are some of the things that we have been exploring in OpenJ9 to see how we can improve the startup time of OpenJ9 and make it as quick as possible. Uh, we come to the end of this talk. I'll just quickly summarize what we discussed today. So we looked at uh, we looked at the challenges that the cloud environment presents to the runtime systems and the JVM in particular, and we looked at the mechanisms that OpenJ9 uses to adapt to these challenges, and the features that it has added to improve its performance. So this is not we are not yet done yet, because as the cloud environment is evolving, so is OpenJ9, and we are actively evaluating new technologies in the cloud landscape to take advantage of them and improve the OpenJ9 performance, so that it can stay the best JVM for the cloud environment. And these are some of the resources that you can go through to understand more about the features or the capabilities of OpenJ9 and what it has to offer in the cloud environment. That's all I have to cover in this slide.